This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. This is a message from Respectonomics. Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley is your voice of Respectonomics. Normally I'd be joined by Sarah Benton. She's not able to join us today. And we're continuing this series of the Kleenex factor. The Kleenex factor is a corporate insight that corporations often prefer to have information that's moved around and transmitted in a manner that is sanitized, it's clean, it's clinical. And while that may be admirable, the approach we're looking at is that the corporation needs to be able to look at itself annually, if you will, but maybe more often, in the same way that we check up on our human bodies. The message today is focusing, we've talked about the brain and we've talked about the heart in previous episodes. This one is talking about the lungs. And before I go any further, we would like to point out that these Respectonomics outlays, these rollouts, they are designed to be also not only in a podcast format, but also designed to be available to corporations or communities, organizations in either workshops or in speeches or in consultations, but more in terms of that face-to-face combination, particularly because it gives people a chance to hear the article, to hear the issues front and center, but also to be able to give people a chance to raise their own points and their own questions. So there's an honest, authentic, two-way conversation in place. So we are recommending that. And if you are minded to have this kind of presentation, consultation, speech, whatever you would like, then contact us at jeremy@respectonomics.com. That's jeremy@respectonomics.com. Now, this particular episode is dealing with the lungs. And the lungs of a corporation, we've talked about the brain as the CEO, the heart of the corporation as the employee. The lungs represent the ability to bring new ideas into a corporation. That's the analogy that we're going to be working on here. That just like when we humanly breathe, we breathe in fresh air, so a corporation needs to be able to breathe in fresh ideas. If you think about it, if we breathe in stale air, or in fact, if we even go one step further and stop breathing altogether, we will, how should we politely put it, leave this mortal coil. So what we're really pointing out is that when a corporation is not exercising its lungs, not exercising the ability to receive these new ideas, there's a significant chance that that corporation will eventually decease. So we want to look at this from several points of view. We've talked about the fresh air and the fresh ideas, and that's the sort of the breathing in part of it. But if you think about breathing, we do another thing too in this analogy. We breathe out. We call it exhaling. And one of the points about exhaling is that we breathe out the air that is no longer useful to us. We call it carbon dioxide. But as we breathe it out, we also then axiomatically create the opportunity to breathe in the fresh air. And this cycle is extremely valuable because it, in fact, is a cycle by which we live. And a corporation that allows fresh ideas to come in and simultaneously to get rid of the old habits, the old ideas, is presenting itself with an opportunity for great advancement, prosperity, innovation, productivity, loyalty, collaboration, and the words go on endlessly. In other words, the concept of fresh ideas coming into a corporation are very well received. They are enjoyable, and they lead to some strengths that we can't achieve, well, quite literally, we can't achieve on our own. That said, there's one almost a barrier to these new ideas, that when we have a new idea, how often have we experienced that sense that someone will say, well, we've tried that before. it almost gets this idea that it's being dismissed. And therefore, one of the keys to new ideas is to have in place a mechanism so that those new ideas can be absorbed, can be brought into, can be introduced into the corporation. Now, if I go and have a respiratory test, it is quite clear to me that there are three things that are going to happen. The first thing we're going to do is to examine the quality of the air. If the air is polluted or it's got toxins in it, that is going to be damaging to the body and damaging to the lungs. So it's quite reasonable that we would want to have a mechanism that checks the quality of the air. Secondly, the air having been inhaled, we need to be sure that the process of inhaling, of moving the oxygen into the bloodstream and so on, we need to know that that is working effectively. So these two issues are very important if we believe in them in terms of our own bodily being. So I go to the doctor to get this checkup, but he or she will then say, we'd better get the air tested. Corporately speaking, the analogy is that we need to have a mechanism that checks or filters the ideas as they're coming in. So that's part one of the puzzle. But part two of the puzzle is that we also need to have an opportunity to distill and to process those ideas. Now, this is a critical point. I was talking to a lady who had been on the production line at a major Japanese manufacturing company, automobile, and she'd been there for 30 years. And they had at the end of their production line, they had I think, a box where one could enter suggestions. And I said, oh, well, you probably put ideas into that. And she said, no, we didn't. It wasn't worth the effort. And however you would describe it wasn't worth the effort, the idea of having ideas from people on the line that don't feel there's a value in extending those ideas into the corporation, all it does is it amplifies the risks to that corporation, but it also amplifies the missed opportunities. So that if we're going to have ideas, we not only need to have a process to filter those ideas, just like you would say, I need to check on the quality of the air, fine, but you also need to be sure that your organization is positioned to receive the ideas, that the process is actually working. That would require almost two separate, if you say individuals, organizations, but ways in which the ideas are allowed to flow in. And secondly, that there's a mechanical process, a sort of plumbing approach, really, for those ideas to flow to where they're meant to go. So, with that in mind, we then want to look at something else. And that is that as these ideas come in, I think we all know something humanly. I think it's time to, as it were, for the emperor to take off his clothes or to be seen for what it is. And that is, most of us resist new ideas. We can do it from a point of inertia. We can do it from a place of exhaustion. We can do it, in fact, from a place of pride. I was talking to one individual and asked about his CEO, and he said to me, oh, he said, well, our CEO didn't need any new ideas because he's got them already. So when you find a corporate leadership that is not, in fact, willing to accept or to engage in new ideas, what in fact you're dealing with is someone who is not qualified to be a leader. The definition of a leader is one who continues to want to learn. We've talked about this in previous episodes where we talk about the art of education. The art of education isn't whether you've got a degree from a university. It's very important. But what's also important is that we continue, and you continue, I continue, to want to learn, and that we see the joy of learning. So what we need here is the corporation, when the leadership receives ideas, needs to be able to do so in a manner that is accepting, that is engaging, and to which they will respond accordingly. In other words, when you get a new idea, you actually thank somebody for it and you make sure that there's a follow-up procedure as well. Just like the human body. It receives stuff in, it processes it, and then it lets it out again. Same thing applies to this corporate model. But Where we get into difficulty is this. If we're not willing to accept the new ideas because of whatever reasons we come up with, the risk is, as we've said, that you miss opportunities and you run into new risks, and that's part of the puzzle. But there's another part as well. People receive information and process information differently. And it's called our learning uh, module, your inner learning module. And each one of us is different. And, for example, I work very well by exchanging ideas verbally. The telephone, I talk on it a lot, and I pick up a lot of ideas from other people and massage them, and they massage me. Other people find it's easier to do it in print. Other people like to sit down and listen. Whatever the mode is, here's a key point that the leadership needs to examine: how do they learn? What is it in their style of receiving information? How do they personally, individually, how do they learn? What is it that allows them to learn? Because if a leader is understanding of how he or she is learning, far better chance that that leadership individual will in fact then be responding to the staff, the employees, the complement, will be responding to people, suppliers, shareholders, come on, the list goes on, but be able to respond to those individuals in a way of understanding how they learn, how they receive information, how they interpret. The the classic example is that when you used to get the message that says everybody was sent the email. Well, if you don't respond to emails in the sense of cerebrally, that you don't actually connect well with emails, you can receive 100 emails a day, but they do not, in fact, impact on you. They don't embrace you. So in other words, there may need to be another way to communicate with you. Here's something that I find very interesting. I was at my desk for 51 years. And in those 51 years, we had enormous amounts of money and time and funding and talent and all kinds of executive responsibilities looking into the segmentation of the market, trying to understand which part of the market was the part we were after. How did people respond to our services? What is it that they wanted more of or less of, frequency, and so on. And these were very, very good assessments and very useful to the development of the business. But I have a question. If in fact the segmentation, we'll call it that, of the market is so important, how come I was never segmented? How come no one ever said to me, how do you want to be treated? How do you find it easy to receive information? Do you like receiving it at night, in the morning, daytime? How do you like to get it? Do you like to talk to people? I was never once asked how to be segmented. And I think that, we think, Respectonomics thinks, that the lungs depend on new ideas. But those new ideas will only take, what would you call it, traction or grip, if in fact people are willing to see how they can be absorbed into the system. The lungs do a stunningly good job of bringing the oxygen into the system. Let's have a lung system corporately that allows those ideas to be integrated into the corporation. But for those ideas to be received, for people to be able to say, this is an idea worth exploring, we'd like to explore it anyway, it does need a sense of understanding how people transmit information, how they receive it, how they digest it, if you will. But the point of the matter is, the question needs to be asked of how do people learn? This business of new ideas is critically important. We're living at a time when we are being almost suffused, we're being repressed, whether it's by the volume of work, whether it's we are being suffused culturally, but we need the opportunity, the freedom to be able to think that we can come up with new ideas. And the one part of the new idea formula is this: the people at the front counter, the people who are serving the customer, the people who represent the front line, are often the people who have an extraordinary insight into what improvements or enhancements can be made or should be made. And if those enhancements can be made, and if they're available to be made, then we need to have corporately a process by which those ideas can be moved up and across and throughout the organization. The resistance to new ideas is a dangerous one. It's no different from holding your breath and saying, I'm not going to breathe any more ideas in. And if you don't breathe in, you can't breathe out. If you can't breathe out, you're not going to live. I want to finalize, though, one thing about this whole business of breathing. If you talk to an athlete is terribly interested in building capacity. So should we be corporately doing the same thing. If the lungs are more capacious, more able to handle more oxygen and to translate that oxygen into the bloodstream, that is going to be an effective athlete. And if a corporation wants to be athletic, if it wants to go across the finishing line first, then having lung capacity makes sense. Having lung capacity is the ability to inhale and to ingest new ideas. The other part is this, though, that when a business wants to move ahead the way we've described, they're bringing these new ideas. There's also the issue of exhaling. And here's an interesting dynamic for the athlete. The athlete knows that if she wants to go faster, let's say they're a runner, one of the ways to do it is to exhale very explicitly and very definitively. You literally breathe out. Because when you breathe out, out goes the stale air, out goes all the ideas that weren't really working any longer. And on top of that, the reflex action, which is how lungs work, the reflex action is to take in a deep breath, but that new air that comes in is able to go right the way down to the bottom of the lungs. In other words, it's a deep breath. But that deep breath was, if you will, enabled by the process of exhalation. Exhale, get rid of the old ideas, bring in the new ideas, and they go in deep. The last thing, lungs are things that we don't really think about very much, do we? I breathe, I wake, I sleep. When I need more lung capacity, when I'm running or something, it comes on pretty well. And that's wonderful. But here is the thing that we need to be aware of. I can be very complacent about my lungs. I can almost ignore them. I'm breathing. It's working. What's the thought? So there has to be a recognition of the incredible complexity of the lungs, the respiratory process, and that as we understand that, then also let's apply those realities to the way in which we conduct ourselves corporately. That there is no basic complacency to the lungs. They are vital, they are beautiful, they work very well, and we can puff them up and breathe in fresh ideas and bring ourselves into new periods of prosperity, but also with new ideas, be able to be prepared for things that might not be so good. If you're running and you see something ahead that you don't like, you can start taking evasive action. We can take evasive action when, in fact, we allow the new ideas to percolate, to be ingested into our human frail, in this case, into the corporate frail. And that's the message today, and I rest my case.